morning, lovelies. Today we're going to talk about the male gaze in film, what it is, how to subvert it, and its opposite, the female gaze. The male gaze is a buzzword that you've probably heard thrown around in certain feminist or writing circles. It's mostly concerned with visual media, things like movies, but also shows, comics, and graphic novels. It's got a lot of loaded history and controversy around it, but I'm gonna do my best to try to define it for you, offer examples, and then show writers how they can avoid or subvert it. So what is the male gaze? Now you're gonna have to excuse me real quick. I do try to look directly at the camera when I do these videos. My script is right here in the laptop, but other than some brief looks up and down, I do try to avoid actually staring at this thing. But in situations like this, I spend a lot of time on scripts like this one, and I don't want to offer misinformation or wrong facts because I remembered them wrong or something like that, especially when the script is right in front of my face. So I am going to be looking down for a lot of this video. Sorry about that. But anyway, the male gaze. This is a film theory that was highlighted by Laura Mulvey in 1975. The male gaze refers to how women are depicted, sexualized, and objectified in film from a cis-male male's point of view. Now, before I move forward, I'm going to say something before the comments start. There is nothing wrong with a man's point of view in storytelling. There is nothing inherently wrong with male directors or screenwriters. And not every movie directed by a man objectifies or sexualizes women. Lord of the Rings might highlight the beauty of some of its women actors more so than the men, but it hardly sexually objectifies them. Black Panther is another great example of a male-directed movie that does not utilize the male gaze. Rather, it focuses on the power, bravery, and actual character of its women, rather than trying to sexually objectify them. No, the male gaze is specifically talking about the view of the toxic masculine ideal that promotes sexual aggression and violence, and how that view depicts women on screen. It's basically if that misogynistic frat boy that you sometimes see in horror movies were directing the entire movie. That's the male gaze. And it is everywhere. It is so common that it is considered the default. It is very hypersexualized and treats female characters specifically as objects for the male protagonist to use. Little more than ornamentation, really. Not just that, but it is also designed and written in such a way that the audience, especially the cishet male audience, is supposed to ogle over the actresses. One example of the male gaze is something we've all seen before. It's that slow camera shot that starts at her feet and then it moves up her legs, up to her always thin stomach or butt, her breasts, and we might see her face. Even Wonder Woman has been subjected to the male gaze, with those shots in that Justice League movie that go up her skirt. Ugh. And of course, we have all seen those horribly impractical costume designs where we're supposed to believe that an office worker can run around in a full sprint in heels, or that these professional soldiers will happily wear armor that exposes her midriff and all of those vital organs. Or the filmmakers will stick in a totally irrelevant, unnecessary shot of the woman in her underwear that either has no impact on the story or even detracts from it. A classic example, the male gaze encourages the audience to objectify Megan Fox and her body as she fixes the car in Transformers, rather than having mechanics be part of her character's actual character and personhood. You'd think that having a character who knows a thing or two about cars would be useful and interesting in a movie about alien car robots, but no. The skill is, practically speaking, never mentioned again. The line between mechanic and medic must be non-existent for the Transformers. The writers could have made her to be one of their most powerful, interesting allies as she's patching up their wounds in the middle of battle, frantically trying to save them in time so that they can save the world. But why do any of that when you can just talk about how hot she is? When it comes down to it, the male gaze treats the women in its stories as nothing more than objects. Even when the women in question are canonically powerful, intelligent, and interesting, compassionate, empathetic, and actual person, the male gaze will strip all of that away from her for at least a few minutes, because ultimately none of that matters. Her personhood does not matter. Her character does not matter. All that matters is how physically attractive she is. That's the male gaze. So what is the female gaze? Logically speaking, if the male gaze is told from the lens of a hetero male eye that objectifies women, then the female gaze will be the opposite, right? It'll be a hetero female eye that objectifies men. You would think so, but that's not the way that people are actually using the term. In fact, some critics argue that the much rarer, by the way, objectification of men in film is just a different expression of the male gaze turned on male bodies, which hardly seems fair, in my opinion, and I'll get to that in a minute. Right now, I want to share with you, the actual definition of female gaze. So much like how the male gaze is defined by the perspective of male filmmakers and how they portray women, the official definition of the female gaze is the perspective of female filmmakers and how they portray women. The subject matter is still women. It's just who is behind the camera that's different. While the female gaze does not, by any means, ban sex, desire, and related fantasy, that focus tends to be less common in women-directed movies. When sex and desire do appear, they are portrayed in a way that lets the target of that desire, the female character usually, retain her personhood without being objectified. In fact, she is usually a major character and gets a narrative arc over the course of the story. Jennifer's Body, the cult classic horror film, does this really well while taking crack shots at the male gaze. It's hilarious. The Take, a really great YouTube channel that basically does what I do but better, has a really great video on Jennifer's Body and another one on the male gaze versus the female gaze, and I'm gonna link both of them in the description for you. But back to the definition, the female gaze supposedly puts men, women, and everyone else on even footing. It is supposed to be a more universal story and viewing experience. And I honestly have mixed views about calling that the female gaze. Because women do occasionally objectify men. We're just discouraged from doing so. Female sexuality is punished, not rewarded. And since everyone is taught from birth that men are actual people who deserve respect, it is a lot harder to strip them of their personhood and turn them into a pure sex object, even if it's just for a few minutes. And compare this attitude to the men in our society, who are in many ways encouraged to act like that misogynistic frat boy you see in horror movies. Men, at least American men, are supposed to objectify women and see them as sex toys rather than actual people with other skills, wants, desires, because that attitude of objectification is what helps keep men in power. But all of that does not mean that male objectification does not exist. It does. Anyone who has a casual interest in superhero movies, for instance, will be the first to point out all the times that the guys have to take off their shirts for no apparent reason and show off their muscles to, the audience, as well as usually the girl that they're trying to turn into their girlfriend. Now, that type of thing is partially driven by a male fantasy of wanting to be that guy with the muscles, but there is objectification wrapped up in there too. And defining the male gaze as unflatteringly as we do, while giving the female gaze a near glorifying definition, does a disservice to male allies, puts women on a pedestal we frankly don't deserve, and erases genderqueer identities. Speaking of which, people who claim that the female gaze is supposed to be all about equality and inclusiveness and be more universal to tell stories, it often overlooks the fact that it's a very white female gaze. I mean, stories that utilize the female gaze do tend to focus on young, white, middle-class cis women rather than women of color, poor women, old women, genderqueer femmes, or women with disabilities. Again, think Wonder Woman, but instead of Justice League, we're not going to talk about her movie, Wonder Woman. While it did a great job of portraying a female character who has both a narrative arc and sexual desires, it put a lot of focus on this conventionally pretty, young, white princess, while almost completely ignoring every other type of woman that appears or could have appeared in this story. I mean, personally, I think that we should call this universal story that we're going for the gender-neutral gaze, because a woman's experience is no more universal than a man's. And, it might be nice to redefine the male gaze as like the toxic male gaze or the toxic masculinity gaze or the pervy gaze. Perv gaze. Praise? Other people on the internet have been using the term looking respectfully in place of the female gaze because that's really all we want. If you're going to film women as objects of desire, fine, just do it in a way that's respectful and lets us be human. Unfortunately, we are stuck with the term female gaze versus male gaze, so in order to avoid confusion, I'm stuck with using those for the rest of this video. Sorry. So let's talk about how to spot the difference. And I think the best way to do this is through the character of Harley Quinn. Hardly original, I know, but it's so easy. So let's take a look at her first appearance in Suicide Squad. Not the Suicide Squad, which I have not seen yet, but I've heard is good. I mean the crappy one. We'll break this down piece by piece. First of all, the costume design. The bangs are artfully framing her face. She got the strategically ripped clothing, the heels for battle, the push-up bra, the fucking dog collar. That's bad enough, but the camera angle, when it goes on her, it focuses a lot on her ass and chest. You got that classic pervy male gaze shot going up her near naked body as she's getting dressed for battle. You know, before she's got her shirt on, of course. And we're supposed to feel okay with that because all the other men on screen are gazing at her too, just like us. It's that attitude of, it's okay to be a perv if everyone else is doing it. And finally, the writing. How she is actually written in this movie. She's obsessed with her boyfriend. Now granted, she's Harley Quinn, and her relationship dynamic with the Joker has always been toxic. But practically every single scene in this movie where she has any significant amount of dialogue centers around the guy rather than literally anything else. So let's compare this to Birds of Prey. First of all, the costume design. The bangs are choppy and fun. In fact, one of the first things she does in this movie is she cuts her hair so it doesn't look sexy or long enough to pull on. You know, pulling on the pigtail, she's getting rid of that symbolically. She also gets rid of the dog collar-like necklace when she officially blows up her and Joker's spot. Throughout the course of the movie, she actually looks like she dressed herself, both for fun and casual hanging out and for battle, rather than had a horny guy dress her. The camera angle for the most of the movie, it does the wide shots for the action scenes, of course, but those action scenes display her power, her creativity, her athleticism and gymnastics. And when she's not fighting, the camera angle focuses on her face rather than her body. And finally, the writing. She's not obsessed with the Joker, she is recovering from her breakup with the Joker. He's not defining her role in this story. She's dealing with the morality of looking after a kid that's wanted by a ton of criminals in Gotham versus giving her up to save her own skin. I mean, the whole story is basically about her figuring out who she is as a person, rather than whether or not her boyfriend's gonna come and rescue her. And yes, I'm focusing on Harley here in Birds of Prey because she's a very easy comparison to make versus Suicide Squad, but the movie Birds of Prey does the same thing with all of its female characters, many of them women of color. I am so annoyed that more people don't love Birds of Prey. It is one of my top 10 favorite superhero movies. Honestly, top 5. So this finally leads us to the million-dollar question that I'm sure many of you have been wondering, especially if you clicked on this video, which is, how do you subvert or avoid the male gaze in your own writing? Avoiding the male gaze is relatively easy. You just gotta write your female characters as people, not objects. I've got a lot of videos on that, a whole playlist even that I will link in the description. In some of those videos, I've mentioned something called the Mako-Mori test. To pass the Mako-Mori test, a story has to have at least one woman character who has a narrative arc, a complete narrative arc, that focuses on something other than a guy. It is very hard, not impossible, but hard, to have a male gaze and pass the Mako-Mori test at the same time. And even if you do manage to pull that off, your audience is going to be a lot more likely to, forgive or dismiss your male gaziness just for having a well-written female character. Or at the very least, they'll see what else you have or stick around for your next story in the hopes that you improve. Look, so long as you focus on giving your female character a narrative arc that does not revolve around someone else's dick, you should be okay. Now, the subversion of the male gaze is a little trickier, as is the subversion of pretty much any trope, but you do it basically the same way. Often by making fun of it too. Cabin in the Woods did this by originally introducing our two leading ladies, Dana and Julie, as full human beings that are intelligent, well-rounded, actual people. The male gaze in film tends to introduce the women's bodies first, then their faces, and then their personality. But the Cabin in the Woods opener for Dana and Julie focuses almost entirely on their faces and their interactions with each other. Julie's excited for the possibility of sex at their cabin getaway, of course, but it's mostly for the sake of Dana's happiness and mental health, since she's trying to get over a bad relationship and Julie's trying to give her a rebound to help with that. I mean, yeah, Dana's in her underwear for this opening scene, but that's mostly for comedy's sake, and it also shows us just how comfortable she is around her best friend. The focus of this scene is on their friendship, their bond, and that they're having fun. They are people in this scene, pure and simple. And then, through the machinations of the antagonist, Julie's personhood is stripped away until she is nothing more than a sexy stereotype, ready to bang and then die. The camera only goes for the male gaziness when her actual personality is almost completely gone. And it's mostly done for comedy's sake, since the next shot shows her two friends looking incredibly unimpressed with her. The goal is not to get the audience to ogle over her, not really. The goal is to get us to laugh at the absurdity, at the ridiculous way that the horror genre has historically treated women. And then we feel bad for Julie, because this bright, interesting, fun woman has had her entire being altered and stripped away so that some guys could use her body for their own needs. Now, this was more of a subversion of the ultra-specific horror virgin stereotypes often seen in horror movies, but I think it works equally well in this context. Now, a more recent subversion of the male gaze that I've seen came from a graphic novel that I critiqued that featured a kidnapped woman who is trying to escape this horrible, the bad guys basically want to eat her because they're like ritualistic cannibals. It's actually the sequel to this one, which I will link in the description because it's a really fun read, you should get it. Now this one, Volume 1, features two major femme characters, one of whom plays a damsel in distress role and needed the main male character to bail her out. Volume 2, which has not come out yet, so I won't spoil anything, introduces a different woman to be our damsel, although she is a lot more competent, and that is in fact why the creators brought me on to critique it. The writer was mostly worried about a scene near the end of Volume 2 where the character is forced into this bridal dress by the bad guys that she tears up before escaping. You know, she does that thing that, you know, some girl characters will do where they'll tear the skirt of the dress so you can actually kick and move around in it, and I'm pretty sure that's an honest-to-God fantasy that so many actual girls have. I mean, yeah, the tearing of the dress shows off more skin, but its practical purpose is that it gives her more freedom of movement. It allows her to fight, and it also symbolically rejects the role that the villains are trying to force her into. And I loved that because that is exactly what I would have done in that situation. It also helps that despite being scantily clothed most of the time, this character was never drawn in such a way that zoomed in on her breasts or butt or contorted her body in those unrealistically sexy poses. She's put in ill-fitted rags that show the vulnerability of her in this situation, and that's never given the tagline of, "But isn't it hot?" No, it's awful, and the story makes no effort to disguise that. She is being tortured, and at no point is it supposed to be attractive. She was written and drawn as a three-dimensional character for us to root for, not an object for us to drool over. And that is how you both avoid and subvert the male gaze. If you're still not sure about your story specifically, get yourself some women beta readers and critique partners. And I mean multiple. The more the merrier. I'll throw a link to my own website in the description because I've actually started doing this professionally. And that is the difference between the male gaze and the female gaze, as defined by critics. We have all seen 1,000 movies that use the male gaze, either subconsciously or otherwise, so I would like to ask you guys if you know any good movies or shows that utilize the female gaze. Preferably science fiction, fantasy, or horror, but I'm not picky. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies!